Hey everybody, welcome to Dev Empathy Book Club, where we inspire each other to become better developers and better people to build our empathy skills. So today we are going to be going through the second half up to chapter 15, 16 of the Mythical Man Month, which we had started last month, and talking about how that applies to our day-to-day and or how it doesn't in some cases. And what I kind of wanted to start off with was how, if any, have our thoughts changed from our first foray into this book? I thought it was very interesting how we all I honestly found our own takeaways kind of interesting after the first half. So I'm interested to see if that changed at all or if it was reinforced. Amy, do you have any thoughts after reading through the book in full?
Just not, but I think kind of in the same line.
Oh, I think we lost you there for a second, Amy.
Yeah, I also couldn't hear, but I think it looks like you're back. So maybe you want to try again. Oh, all right, maybe I'll just jump in and
yeah, give me your thoughts while she's working on her setup.
Sure. So it was interesting for me because the first set of chapters are kind of more foundational. The idea of the Mythical Man Month, which of course eventually became the title of the book, and the thing that people really still talk about today a lot. The first chapter, talking about the sense of wonder that's inherent in the programming craft. A lot of these very foundational concepts, and I think that part two, so to speak, which we arbitrarily divided up, was a lot more about the specifics of how software development worked in a particular period of time, right? So you're talking about what year was this published again? It was in the 70s, I believe.
Yeah, 73, something like that.
And it's funny, but it's true that the kind of hardware that you're working with does absolutely influence your process, right? The tools that you're working with change the way that you operate and the way that you have to operate. And a lot of the things that the book talks about and is concerned about are less relevant today. And it also I found the examples a little bit harder to follow along with because the technology is just so completely from a different, from a nobler age, you might say, if you're a big Star Wars fan. But I think I've messed up that quote. But anyway, a more civilized age. There we go.
There we go. I think people will get it. Yeah, I can add on to that and say, so I was talking to a coworker today about the book, and it's one of those things where at this point, and I know we said this in the first half, where it feels so far removed from our day-to-day now that it does feel more like you're reading a history book almost. Like, oh, this is so interesting. It feels like it's too far removed to be imaginable. I feel like the edition I have is from 1982. This was the revised edition. So it's still older than I am. And I feel like probably in 1982, people went, oh yeah, that makes total sense. I can totally see that, because they were just remembering back like a decade ago. Now we're remembering back like 40 years ago. Time when we can't relate it back to just oh, this is what people used to do. This is what people really used to do. But so I think once I got past some of the real technical examples, what really drove home to me even more in the second half was this is a people problem. Even though this says essays on software engineering, it's all about software engineering, it really comes back down to people. How you work with people, how people work together, the problems of working with people. And I think that's the thing we can still take from this. And I just really want a Mythical Man Month book written in 2017 that's 1/10 of the size. This already isn't a big book, but I feel like there's a lot you could cut out and just get right to, these are the important points, Yeah. I find that really interesting.
Well, in this edition, you kind of did that. This is the 20th anniversary edition, which I believe at this point is more than 20 years old. So ponder that for a minute. But in the new edition, he basically distills the previous chapters all into one chapter of just bullet points all the way through. Mm-hmm. You definitely loses something in translation, but but ultimately, like, yeah, there's stuff that was kind of based on a certain set of examples, and I think it gained something from the examples when those were relevant examples, when people understood what those examples were about. At this point, a little bit harder to really fully, grasp that for us. But at the same time, I think there was a lot of stuff in there. It was just, I think, a little bit of a harder read than part one.
Yeah, no, I agree. I found it harder to read than I would like to admit. Like, it's not a school textbook, which actually I enjoyed reading in school a lot, but I'm like, oh God, this is a little bit drier than I'd like it to be. No fault of the book, I think. But it looks like Amy's back. We were just wrapping up thoughts on the change from the first half to the second half, and I want to make sure I give you a chance to say anything you have on that before we move on.
Yeah, I think what I heard of the last few points, especially that it's a little more dry, which is difficult to have it translate many years later. Definitely rang true. The book continued to feel like a blast to the past, kind of. But I really did appreciate some of the chapters that seemed to dig in a little bit more into how to communicate, as opposed to how to organize your team and that sort of thing, which didn't necessarily hold up as well.
Yeah, I definitely saw that time and time again. And speaking of which, something that Ariella brought up was from chapter 9, talking about program space, and how some of the stuff that was really archaic might still be relevant in some situations. You want to kind of elaborate on your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it was sort of funny because I read chapter 9, what's it like, a 10 pound something and a 5 pound sack, basically all about the all these procedures and things that you have to do around making sure that you manage space. And I think that it actually did have a lot to offer in terms of wisdom about how to manage a limited resource. It's just sort of like it's in the 20th anniversary update. He talks about how much criticism, and again, this is the 20th anniversary edition, and this chapter was written 20 years before that, right? So 40 years ago. But in that midpoint between then and now, he talks about how much flack Microsoft Word 6 got because it required a whole 4 megabytes of memory. And I'm thinking about, like, this Google Hangout probably requires tens, if not more, times that amount of memory, and that's just one single application, and one of probably 30 tabs I have open at any given time in one program. Let's not even talk about Slack. So it's clearly a different world, but it is true that that we still have such things as limited resources. Just over time, they tend to shift towards people, which means you have to take an entirely different approach. But at the same time, it sort of occurred to me a little bit later on that, well, that's true that we don't usually worry about space, but that's also because we're most likely writing programs that don't have to be downloaded on a frequent basis on a web page. But if we're front end engineers, then actually that can matter a whole lot. And there's still a lot of practices that are that are even till today that are still being developed for how to compress programs. We started with removing white space and then uglification, and now Ember is starting to actually compile its templates into a more dense format. Angular is starting to use tree shaking. There's a lot of really interesting stuff that's going on in that space, and it's sort of interesting to see some of these old debates being revived in the context of one of the most modern of technologies, by which I mean JavaScript doing lots of stuff within a browser. So there was that thing, but I think there's actually one little bit of wisdom which the book offered, which was especially relevant in the context of JavaScript frameworks. And I'm just going to pull a very short quote. One frequently hears horror expressed that a 2 megabyte machine may have 400K devoted to its operating system, which by back-envelope math means it's 1/5 is the OS, 1/5 of the hard disk. This is as foolish as criticizing a Boeing 747 because it costs $27 million, which is also laughable, of course, in today's money. But anyway, one must also ask, what does it do? And basically thinking about that trade-off of what things do for you as opposed to how much space it takes up. Like, that is actually a talk people are, or discussion people are still having about JavaScript frameworks. People are talking about, oh, React is great because it's so lightweight, except that you have to throw in all these other libraries. And then, people complain about how Ember is too big or Angular is too big without thinking about, yeah, but what does it give you? What code don't you have to write? How does it compare with the overall size of your application? How often are people actually downloading it? What kind of connections are they using? Are they using, high-speed connections on effectively landlines most of the way? Or are we talking about, people in third world countries? Think about if WhatsApp, every byte that they save is a byte that someone doesn't have to download over a shoddy 2G connection in a third world country. So really, this balance of what does it do versus the space it takes up is still, I think, very alive and well today, but not in the context that you might expect it. Or
yeah,
certainly not in the context that they would have expected it back then.
Agreed. No, this is definitely something that I have some thoughts on, and I will dive into those. But I wanted to make sure I gave Amy a chance to say anything before I go into my thoughts on this.
Yeah, I definitely think it's interesting what crops up as your, resource limitation. For us, it's that our particular setup, we end up limited on the number of database connections. So, I can probably give you a count right now off the top of my head of exactly how many we expect at any given point during the day, and when we can get close to the max, which, that's the beauty of that is that it was the result of architecture decisions that allowed us to move very quickly. So I think to a certain degree, it's interesting to see him go from, I think one of the chapters we ended on, if not the chapter we ended on last time, where he was talking about the virtues of a high-level language, and how much you can move faster on it. I think it was interesting to see the author continue to have the age-old debate of, if I have more stuff ready to go and I don't have to optimize it, how quickly can I move? And then at what point do you get to the breaking point and have to, go back? But yeah, no, I'd be curious to hear what you thought, Justin.
Basically say it's true. You always have these constraints. Sometimes you don't think you do. And I think, if anything, this is a wonderful reminder to modern developers that constraints do exist. I think so many developers just throw it off. They just don't even consider it until it's an issue. Then they go, oh no, we have to optimize, what actually is going on here. And the JavaScript framework debate that Ariel brings up is a good one, because, there's people who will argue back and forth about using Preact versus React because Preact's half the size. But if you include one header image or a font in your website, that's bigger than the entire library. So you have to bring into the context of, what is this library doing for my application? And then this has been a very big issue for me the last year or two, because I moved not very far. So I live in Austin, Texas. My office right now gets 800 down, 500 up. I live 20 minutes out of the city, and I get 1 down and 1 up. My 3G phone is so much faster than my internet, and I have websites daily that just don't work. They just don't work. Websites you just load and they just crash. They just completely crash because they expected to be able to get more packets to you faster, or they expected something to be there that wasn't there in time. And it's faster for me to drive into town to a Starbucks with my PS4 or something than to let it download a patch that takes 72 hours. So it's really interesting that it's I am in one of the tech hub cities of the world, and 20 minutes out of downtown, I can't get internet that's faster than DSL from the early 90s. So it's still an issue today, because it just forces my wife and I to just use the websites that we know work. Facebook always works. YouTube always works because they've optimized for these different speeds. But you go to someone else's website and it just crashes. But it's helped me become much more aware of when I'm building websites, like, what am I sending? Like, oh, I remember just being the person who would say, well, just include this in the JSON response. The client might need it later. It's like, no, don't send it if they don't need it. Like, don't give them more information, because it's going to slow it down. It's going to be more requests that need to be processed. And it helped me be more aware of just resource intensity, not just actual bandwidth. And I thought that was an interesting, evergreen topic, because it's so easy to forget that's actually a thing. And not in third world countries, but in every country, just depending on where you are.
And even if, I mean, you're talking about how I guess in you're sort of a special case because your phone is faster than your than your your landline, but there's definitely people who are using data to access the internet are very often even if you're not in a third world country, right, you're still concerned about how much upload download you're using up. You want to make sure you don't hit your limit over the course of the month, and there's sort of this trend, at least in design, which is probably a good thing, of designing everything mobile first, and you shouldn't have a separate mobile site. You should only have your regular site, and then just have use CSS to display different things and different size screens, and that's all well and good, but if you're still downloading all the same junk, first of all, it's going to run super slow on any phone that's not, top of the line modern phone, which a lot of people still have. And if you're actually using data, that could be really annoying to people, that suddenly there's just this huge spike in how much data that they're using because of your application. And that's going to be the thing that drives people away. So, it's a constraint. It's one use case, but it's something that we have to be really careful about.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to the idea of empathy for the user. I've heard other podcasters before use this term empathy for the machine, which is a general joke about go easy on your processors. The machine doesn't really need empathy in the way we normally talk about it, but it's hey, if you don't need to use this much memory, don't. And that's generally can translate to empathy for your users, because especially if it's any client-side code, it's going to run on their machines. So you have to understand what are their requirements going to be. What are their, like you just said, what kind of speed can they generate this at? If they don't have an accelerated GPU, this is going to be rough, to have all these animations on the page. And actually, that makes me want to transition into something slightly related. One chapter I really enjoyed was the plan to throw one away chapter, which really talked about just the idea that change is a necessity. And to me, it was just the whole time I'm reading, I'm this is Agile. This is 30 years for Agile was a thing, but this is it. This is it. Because whenever I give a talk about Agile or I teach a workshop on it, I have to reinforce that Agile is not Scrum, right? That's, I think, what people get in their head. And there's a talk there to have. But when I want to go back to what the fundamentals of Agile is, it really comes down to responding to change and being aware that change is a constant, that it's always going to happen. And I like that it didn't just talk about patterns that the chapter didn't just go into how to architect your assembler code so that it can change quicker. It was no, just be aware that's going to happen. Write your code in a way that you know that's going to happen. And also they talked about the idea that your organization will change. And this is something I feel never gets talked about, and it's something I still see friends and people in the industry deal with all the time, which is the structure of my team was changed. We lost someone, we gained someone, we have a new manager, we've moved someone into departments, and then everything seems to just either crawl to a halt or start to crumble in small ways, because there was no plan for what happens if the way we're doing our job day to day doesn't persist. How are we going to recover from that? And I wanted to know what your thoughts were on that type of topic. Amy?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, and I think this chapter specifically made me think of the concept of a first night journey. I don't remember quite what the name of this is, but if you are going on a long trip, for instance, if you're I think this case was for surveyors in the American West. They would do one night where they would hike 5 miles, maybe 10, camp the night 10 miles out of town, and then if they had forgotten anything, or if they had, realized, oh shoot, these boots are just not going to work in this weather, then you can just walk back to town, and then you can start right back out. So I really like the idea you have of, it being more about embracing change. But the way I read it was more along the lines of, dear Lord, how complicated is it to like start off the waterfall process? Like in that world, like you really would have needed like this mindset of we're just going to throw one away. And that would have been groundbreaking. In the same way that like you do only like one night out, as opposed to just like treating every night as this kind of something that you could redo. So yeah, I don't know. I think I read that in combination with the 20-year reflection of the author, where he basically said, yeah, waterfall is dead, as kind of an acknowledgement that definitely plan to throw one away, but maybe plan to throw hundreds away.
And then just making sure that, those hundreds are very small iterations, because if you do 100 big iterations, then you're never going to finish. Yeah, it was sort of interesting to see how he retracted it, but didn't. He said like it was a good idea for its time, but there's way better ways of going about things.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't have a lot to add.
Yeah, it's interesting because, like you said, better at its time, even then probably wasn't entirely true. But everything you say is always in the context of your current like ecosystem, like your current culture. So every time we say anything, it's going to be in our current culture of like, well, agile is just a thing people do, badly or goodly, but they do it. So like at the time, it was like waterfall's the thing, we just do it. So like his context was this is better than the way you were doing it. Yeah, it's really interesting.
I also think there is a fair degree of truth in that waterfall is very appropriate when you have actual hardware that needs to be built for your particular software. And that my only idea that, I can just throw away hundreds of these things is because if I need more compute, like the choices that our AWS bill is slightly higher this week than not, but not that I need a 9-month lead time to requisition a new physical rack and a new server new blade to go into that rack, and someone needs to be on staff to hook it up. Yeah, I mean, I definitely think the argument that waterfall was appropriate for the projects that he was working on definitely makes a lot of sense to me. But that I am also very happy that we get to make more mistakes.
I agree. I like the leniency we are afforded in our industry, respectively. I've done in the past a lot of reading about how NASA in the past has done software development, how they currently do it. And even today, a lot of it is still very waterfall by our standards. But the developers there like rarely work crunch, and they like their jobs, and they're not being like lorded over by weird architecture masters. But it's a system that they have to take very seriously, and they have to understand the risks and the costs. And it's interesting. I really do think my original thought, as a budding programmer years ago, of waterfall is evil, like it was some boogeyman that people would scare you about, just isn't true. But it's also something you would never suggest to any team. And like if you did, you don't know what you're talking about. It's not a good idea, but it's not like a de facto evil that we defeated in the 90s with a manifesto. But it's a good historical artifact because there is definitely some truth there.
Yeah, I definitely, when I was starting out, I made jokes about request change or change management request forms that had to be filed in triplicate. And while I don't have to file anything like that in triplicate, our pull request flow has like literally the same amount of auditing around it that the form in triplicate. It's just in code, and I don't have to think about it until it goes wrong.
Right.
And I'm so grateful that it's there. Like, so grateful.
Right. No change requests in triplicate, but we have to do this PR. It needs to be approved by 3 people. It's totally different. It's not the same thing at all. Yeah, it's interesting. It's that, time is a flat circle kind of a situation where we start to rediscover the same things over again, where it's like, well, some of this was good. We just have to keep it in check this time so we don't let it go over. So one thing that Ariel had brought up was in chapter 12, talking about about flow state, and I just wanted to give him a chance to kind of talk about that and what his thoughts were around the idea of flow.
Yeah, this was interesting. It was not the focus of the chapter at all. It was really more about just the way that at that time Brooks felt you could best make use of scarce hardware resources. So if you have a whole bunch of teams working on the same system and everyone's of course writing it out or creating the cards, and like every so often they get a little dose of machine time to actually test their stuff in the real world. And so the question was, now how do you apportion that machine time? And for a while the idea was maybe look at like a couple teams, we'll like split up into blocks, and then like each block would be taken over by a few teams, and they would like rotate during that block. Everyone grabs a shot, and then this one grabs a shot, then that one grabs a shot. And eventually he said, what we're going to do is we're just going to have the whole system be reserved for one team for a 6-hour block, and nobody else gets to touch it. And if the machine sits, then it sits. Which is actually very interesting from a kind of a factory optimization perspective. The idea of 100% utilization is not always the best plan. And this was really kind of taking into account human psychology over this core idea of like, oh, if the machine's sitting idle, like how terrible. But what he said, and again, I think the line was just really nice. He said 10 shots in a 6-hour block, 10 shots meaning 10 opportunities to run through your code, are far more productive than 10 shots spaced 3 hours apart, because sustained concentration reduces thinking time. So he was talking about the cost of context switching. Today we know there's also this idea of flow state. If you put those two together, obviously having a cohesive unit of time that you can just do a bunch of work, and then afterward you can sit, you can analyze, you can move a little more slowly. But to give people their own exclusive space so that they could operate without having to do constant context switching turned out to be very, very effective. And I think that it's kind of sad that we discovered that in 1965, and today we're still trying to figure out how to let programmers have flow state. So actually, was it 65 or I think it's 75? I might have gotten that backwards.
The book was published in 75, but a lot of the stories are from like 66, 67, 68. So like
right. I think he actually mentions in the intro that the book was published 2 years later than it was supposed to, because he spent 2 years figuring out what pictures to put at the beginning of each chapter.
Oh, so, stories like that.
Yeah. But yeah, I just thought it was interesting that, like the idea of flow state or trying to avoid context switching is not new. Sometimes with the way that we talk about it as if like, we've now discovered America, like this is a new a new thing. And in reality, this is not something that we've just discovered. It's been around for a long time, and we just haven't really figured out a good way to implement it that makes everybody happy.
Yeah, this is something I see come up a lot. The idea of flow state and the idea of preserving it around our day-to-day like work processes. Like how do we schedule our meeting times? I mean, honestly, the idea of the 6 shots in 10 hours 10 shots over 6 hours versus 10 shots over 3 just makes me think of test runtime. Like how quickly does it take you to run your unit tests? I had a situation where my unit tests weren't even taking a long time, but something else they were doing was just taking an extra couple seconds, and that was long enough for me to just kind of lose the thread, Alt-tab over to something else, and then go, oh, it's been 5 minutes and I haven't checked it, But like I just can't sit there and twiddle my thumbs for the 17 seconds it takes to run the 1,000 unit tests, so I just kind of zoned out. So I think it is one of those things of, look, 40 years ago, they understood this idea of short iteration cycles are good. And this is true in psychology. This is true in any kind of pedagogical study. Like you need a short cycle to make progress. And if you are a developer working on a team building something, it's probably mentally taxing. It's probably something you have to figure out, and you need those short development cycles to like make progress on it. And I think that's probably going to remain true forever, but who knows how many more times in the future we'll rediscover this idea. Amy, did you have anything to add on this?
No, I'm primary on call right now, so I have about 3 people pinging me at any one given moment and about 50 different monitoring tabs open. So I don't know what you're talking about with concentration. It doesn't exist.
Yeah, so Amy is not in flow state anytime. And that was actually a good thing. And something I was going to say was, So I run my own business. It's a software consultancy. And at the point I'm at in the growth curve of this company, I still write software every day. And I don't remember the last time I got into flow state because I always have meetings, like 2 to 10 meetings a day sometimes. And they're short. They're just a phone call here or there. But there's no such thing as flow state for me. It's always just get what you can in the middle. And sometimes I'll do like I'll call a night shift. I'll work from like after dinner until bed to catch up on things I couldn't do because of meetings. And I'm always like, oh my God, this is what programming used to be. Uninterrupted hours of staring at the computer screen. It's wonderful. And it's funny. It's interesting. It's not something we can always do in our jobs, but it's something that we sometimes strive for depending on what position we have. And that kind of made me want to kind of shift gears a little bit to this idea of concrete milestones and the definition of done. This was another thing that Ariel had brought up from chapter 14. And I liked how this relates to how we do things today with Scrum, and I always love to talk about that. So Ariel, I'll let you start off, and then I'll follow you up on that.
Sure. This is something I was sort of like looking over today, and he describes something that I think we can probably all relate to from our own experience. That you're sort of like let's assume that you're working in some kind of Scrum type process where there's like a sprint and you have an end, and now you're in like a sprint review meeting. You're having your demo time. And so, you're showing off to all the stakeholders, here's what we got done. And then someone asks, like, was it deployed? Well, like, well, we still got to fix this 1 or 2 little bugs. And, we actually have to get it deployed on the system and make sure that it works and the performance. But like, it's basically done, right? And somehow, like, 6 weeks later, you still haven't actually gotten it shipped and ready. Because it just, there were other priorities, and things turned out to be a little more complex than you thought. And we tend to have this temptation to say, oh yeah, it's done, we're good. Okay, a little bit of cleanup to do, but we're basically done. And then we start showing things off as though they're done, and we convince ourselves that they're really done, and it's just not true at all. And it was just sort of funny to me to see the author talking about this exact thing. He said coding is 90% finished for half the total coding time. Debugging is 99% complete most of the time. And that really struck a chord with me. It just sounded extremely familiar. And it also reminded me of the idea of definition of done in Scrum. I don't know if there's a broader agile world concept definition of done in various frameworks. The one I'm familiar with is the one in Scrum. But basically what it means is the team has to get together and say, okay, here are the things that we need to basically make a checklist. Here are the things that we need to check off. And until we can check off all those things, the task is not considered to be completed. It's still in progress. And what that does is it lets you be more honest about what it means to complete a task. You can actually see how long it takes to complete the task, including all those elements. And you don't just say like, oh, the cleanup will happen in some time that's not, daily stand-up and development and debugging and responding to user issues and all the other things that we do. We're just going to find some time to like sneak in all those cleanup elements, which turn out to be actually a very significant portion of the work that we do. So I really like the idea that, again, the author suggested, and some teams manage to do and some teams really don't, to establish a very clear, concrete, razor sharp, or I think he said a knife edge sharp definition of done that applies universally, that makes it very, very clear what we mean when we say that something is done.
Yeah, I really enjoyed all of this because being in the agile world, being in the consulting world, I feel like this is something I deal with all the time. And the idea of a concrete, specific, measurable, defined idea reminds me of SMART goals. Ever been to a business meeting where you talk about synergy and SMART goals? And SMART goals are specific, measurable, actionable. I don't know what the R is, and timeable. Like they have a thing.
I think R is realistic.
Realistic. They can't be pie in the sky. And then T is they have a time frame to them. And while I always roll my eyes at biz speak like that, it's it's really useful. Like, it's really helpful to have something with those requirements on it. In day-to-day, when I'm teaching people I work with how to get better at estimates, because software estimation is notoriously difficult, one of the biggest like hurdles to get them over is to recontextualize in their mind that how long this will take is not how long you think it'll take you to write the code. It includes testing, it includes QA, it includes deployment, it includes PR review, it includes client acceptance, it includes actual deployment to a staging server, it includes the stand-ups that you'll have to do in the meantime. Okay, now include all of those things in your estimate. And now all of a sudden they're like, oh, that's a lot bigger. I'm like, yeah, that's how wrong you were going to be. Like, you were going to be that off in this requirement. So now re-estimate with everything that it actually requires for something to be even then remotely done, because you might do all those things and it's broken and then you have to keep going. But at least you'll be in the ballpark of how long this something could take if you account for everything that's involved. The current client project I'm on, tomorrow's the last day of our extension because we went over budget. And I remember a month ago, we had like a conversation. The client wanted us to give percentages of how done we were, and everyone said 90%, which is hilarious. That's the exact same number. Like, oh, we're 90% done, like 4 weeks ago, and it was a 12-week project. So that was like, we just kept going. It just, there's always something else. And I remember one of my old mentors used to always joke that the agile definition of done is never. Like, the agile definition of a project being done, not like a story, but a project being done is when it's so low priority, like the priority of doing more work is below spending money. It's like, oh, we don't want to spend money anymore. Okay, we're done. That's how you say it's finished. But other than that, software has never reached any state of completeness. And sometimes just thinking that way helps you recontextualize the way you approach your job day to day.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, you know, what does it mean for software to be done unless you actually define it, right? Like, theoretically, you could always add more features. You could always optimize for performance. You could always rewrite it first you write it from Ruby to Python, and then from Python to Go, and then from Go to Rust, and then from Rust you're like, oh, it's still too slow, so I'm gonna write it in C. You know, you could always find ways of making it, you know, theoretically better. Which, you know, I wouldn't say that those are necessarily better, but I'm just giving an example, right? You can always find ways of making it better, and the point is not to make it the best. The point is to make it good enough that it's no longer worth investing further in it. But then you have to define what is good enough.
Right.
What's and to ship, and what's good enough to you know, again, it depends on the kind of company you are, right? If you're consultancy, so you have like a project, and at a certain point that you deliver something, you know, as far as I understand, you deliver something and they give you money, assuming, you know, hopefully they give you money on time.
Ideally, you deliver something. Ideally, you get paid afterwards.
Right. I've heard there are exceptions to those rules, though. But you know, if you're in a product company, you know, you're just continually working on that product, and then the question is a little bit more subtle. It's not, you know, is the product done? Because of course it's not done. It's just, you know, this thing that we're currently working on about the product. Is this, you know, we're going to work on it as long as it's the most valuable thing to work on, and then we're just going to stop and say it's not perfect. But this other thing, you know, it's like a small child in a candy store, just like, you know, I'm very interested in this candy, but wait a minute, there's that other one. Yeah. And so you're constantly running from thing to thing, but always kind of trying to chase where the real value is. Yeah,
and it's one of those things that it doesn't just affect programmers. Like, this can affect product people or anyone else. Not to just keep talking about all my clients here, but I also have another client currently. We're working on their Rails app that's over 11 years old. Like, they had this built in Rails 2 in 2009. And then they had someone else work on it in 2004. And now we're working on it in 2017. And I don't think this client is ever going to think it's done. Like, we have done 3 revisions. We're getting really good. We're staying on budget. But part of my job as a consultant is to help him get to a point where he agrees, I'm not going to keep tweaking the same page. And this is what he's been doing for over a decade, of tweaking the same pages of this Rails app, wanting new features and new additions and changes. And I think to get it to a part where it's better for him as a client, as a business owner, we need to help him nail down specifically what is doneness for him that is specific and measurable and actionable and realistic, you know, and also time constrained, because I feel like those are part of the issue. I think what he's been having with is just I'll just hire someone else in 5 more years and have them add more features to the same app, you know. So there's always a benefit in doing this.
And is this an app that has not been released?
Yes, it has not been released.
Wow.
You know.
Yeah, I this might be a little far afield, but you know, it took me sort of a long time to come to some kind of conclusion, you know, in my own head as to how to think about the value of an app. And in the end, it's actually pretty simple. Value is the function of, you know, I mean, or value is a per time, you know, thing, and then you just multiply it times the amount of time that it's out there. So if it's, you know, if it's creating, and we can put it in dollars, if it's creating, you know, $1,000 an hour, so how many hours is it out there times 1,000? That's how valuable it is. So the moment that you deploy it is the moment that you start actually making money. Until then, you've just created, you know, more and more inventory. And I think it's possible that a lot of people don't understand that, even though it seems pretty simple and pretty obvious when you hear it. But a lot of people, I think, don't understand that, and so they're like, "Oh, we just got to speak a little more. It has to be perfect." Well, it doesn't have to be great. It has to create enough value to make itself worthwhile.
Right, and there's always the revolving door of, as time marches on, you become dissatisfied with the current state, or you feel like it's just close but not close enough, and you can get in your own head. I do this. When I was launching Lunar Collective, I made the website, and like a month later, hadn't launched it. I'm like, oh, it's not ready yet. And I'm like, oh, I'm gonna do this forever. I just had to like have someone else do git push, and I had to walk away because I was just gonna keep redesigning it forever, because that's just my personality. And having those specific type, like, honestly, deadlines are good. Like, I've worked on projects with deadlines and ones without deadlines, and the ones without end up being a mess, because there's nothing kind of consolidating people to have a priority, and to like really make decisions about what's happening. And I think I'll use that as kind of my segue to talk about this idea of reducing the role conflict, which is another thing else that Ariel brought up, and kind of give me the high level about this part of that same chapter.
Yeah, so this was talking about specifically the situation where, again, to tie it to the last topic, where you have, let's say you have the, you know, the top level boss, and then they have a bunch of, you know, mid-level managers under them, and then, you know, beneath them are all the, you know, the actual developers. And so you could have like a mid-level manager who, you know, who sees that their team is like significantly behind schedule, but they think to themselves, well, you know, we'll cut corners, we'll work overtime, we'll work weekends, we'll make it up, you know. And they basically, as long as they think that they can handle the situation, they don't bring it up with their superiors. They're like, why should I bother them? Like, we'll figure it out. And so the only time the superior hears about it is when it's too late to do anything. There was a discussion about just really on a psychological level how to make the mid-level manager feel comfortable and incentivized to bring up the issues before it becomes an insurmountable problem. And so one thing that I thought was really quite, I want to say the word, I don't know how to pronounce it, prescient, ahead of its time in a way, was basically talking about how you have to create psychological safety for the mid-level manager. And this is decades before the term psychological safety existed, as far as I know. So essentially what he says is, you know, when a mid-level manager passes up that report, if the first instinct of the higher level manager is immediately say, okay, get out of the way, I'm taking over this team, I'm preempting your authority, that's gonna completely remove any desire that the mid-level manager has to bring up the issue with their boss. And so what really needs to happen is accept the status report. You know, he doesn't mention it, but I would say, you know, offer any help that's desired, but basically don't immediately jump in and try to take things over, but instead, you know, accept the honesty, acknowledge it, thank them for it, and be aware of it, you know, and look out for that point when it's going to become something that's impossible. You know, maybe look at the change over time. Is it getting worse? Is it getting better? But trying to avoid preempting authority as much as possible. And you know, to me, that's really important, because it's sort of, you know, you see the idea of fomenting of allowing agency to in this case, it was talking about, you know, higher level administration to lower level administration. But over time, we've extended this, of course, to the team itself, making sure that every individual developer has agency, and making sure they have psychological safety and don't think they're being controlled, but instead are getting a lot of space to make decisions and do the right thing.
Yeah, this is definitely something that's tricky. I don't think it's something that you can correct me if you disagree, but I think it's not something that's been solved in general. And I don't know if Amy has any thoughts on this idea of dealing with management from higher and lower and how to deal with this kind of like reporting chain or not, but I'll give her a chance to chime in if she does.
Yeah, I definitely think that, there's a delicate balance that you have to strike, because I think there is something to saying that this kind of aligns with psychological safety, but at the end of the day, if you don't deliver on time or close to on budget, your job is on the line, right? So I think the part that really resonated with me was like dividing the listening and the hearing and accepting from the action, and I think that's one of the biggest takeaways I think I would pass on to the people who I've seen struggle with hearing bad news, which is that you need to hear it and accept it and ask questions about the situation, and then later you can go in and you can fix it, and if you need to fire people, all that sort of fun stuff. There's a really interesting story, and I can't remember which company it was. They were plagued by exactly the kind of delays that this chapter is talking about, the ones that you don't see creeping up on you, the ones where if you look back on it, you're going to blame it on one big event, but really it's just slipping, and nobody ever knows that something is going to slip until it slips. And I think it was a management book of some sort, and so the new CEO comes in and he starts this process of like, you need to tell me whether, at our weekly meeting, you need to tell me whether this is red, yellow, or green. And, he's a new guy, so the first couple weeks, everything is always green. And he just asks these probing questions, but everything is still always green. And then the first time someone comes up with something yellow, and the whole room goes quiet, and everybody stares at him. He reacts in the way that this book really says is important, that you accept it, that you ask questions about why, but you don't rush any judgment. I thought that was a really nice and clean and simple rule that I think can easily be applied if you have that instinct, similar to like maybe take 3 breaths before you express anger. If you get bad news, don't act on it. Just ask questions.
Yeah, this is good. This is something that makes me, I think a lot about this because I run my own company now. Everyone I hire is de facto below me, which is weird. And I'm not like, I have trouble saying my employees. I just say this guy I work with all the time because I haven't gotten quite used to that. And also I've never worked at a company that had middle management, at least not in a software capacity. I've always worked for small teams. They were almost always consultancies. They're always agile. And that you had 100% agency to do and say anything. And there was a level of stress involved in that because if anything went wrong, every single person was individually 100% responsible for not having pulled the plug or not having, started ringing the bell as soon as you knew something was wrong. But all of you had this weird like standoff. Everyone would know something was wrong, but no one wanted to be the person to ring the bell because even though they were doing the right thing by ringing it, if there wasn't an issue, it was better. So if we could just all keep it clamped down for as long as possible, maybe it would be okay. And of course, it never was. It always ended up blowing up in everyone's face. So there is an interesting balance to be struck between giving people agency, but making them fear the repercussions of saying or not saying something. You know, I have worked at positions in companies where, exactly like you said, the CEO, everyone was always happy, and it was always like good news, good news. And I'm like, that's not possible that every single person's having the best week ever all the time. And then people would just get fired. And you'd be like, but why did they just talked about their amazing quarter. And no one would talk about why they're gone, but it just wasn't good. And it would just happen over and over again. And it was the culture had, while trying to be like a really welcoming, warm culture, had accidentally kind of turned itself into a, we don't talk about failure culture, which is not good either. And it's like, I feel every tier you go at, from entry-level developer to the highest person in the company, there is a different way to take the lessons in this chapter, because it's going to be different for you. Middle management, lower level management, higher management, you have to handle things correctly, but differently than every other level. And I see a lot of mismanagement where people think they're at a different level than they're at. Like they act like a CEO, but they're a middle manager, and that doesn't help you. Or they're a high level manager and they micromanage everyone. And it's like, oh, we need more management training. We need more people to be trained in management, especially in software roles where people get like promoted from software developer to manager. And it's like, that's not always a very good role to be managed, to be promoted into in a lot of situations. And I talked for a while there, so I want to give anyone a chance to say anything else about that before I bounce off of it.
Yeah, I actually do want to bounce off of it a little bit, but not too far off. I loved his discussion in chapter 11 about the way that management positions and development positions relate to each other. So there's a sort of like this natural assumption of, well, the developers are the code monkeys, and that you're all doing your typing, and then and the managers are telling everybody what to do. And so obviously developers work with managers. The manager, the managerial ladder is a higher level than all the developers. And it turns out that's not a way to recruit and maintain great development talent. It's also not a way to make developers feel very respected. So and it also doesn't really correspond to the degree of talent and and honestly value creation that happens in each of those roles, and also ignores the amount of leadership that technical people have to display also. So he mentioned a few of the various models that different companies have, maybe having parallel management and development tracks, and like these equivalent rungs on each side. And he had a few a few notes which were sort of amusing. One thing he said is, if you get assigned from the technical ladder back over to the management ladder, then that should not come with a raise, and in the opposite direction should always come with a raise, because of overcompensating for the cultural forces. But it was just sort of funny to me, thinking about how the industry really hasn't learned, and this is still a concern. I mean, I've complained about this in the past, certainly, that management roles tend to be better compensated. I don't think it's because it's harder to find good managers. I mean, it's hard to find good managers. That's true. It's not hard to find managers, at the very least. And it's probably not that hard to find good managers if we just actually wanted to invest in training them, rather than just like throw them and assuming, like, oh, you have some kind of management something, so you just go do this and you'll be great. But there's definitely like, one thing that I read this blog post by Charity Majors, which I think really hit the nail on the head, which said that the best managers are the people who go back and forth between development and management, like a few years here, a few years there, and then back and back and forth, their whole career, keeping you never do both at the same time, because that's not possible to really do very well. But you're not a manager long enough that you forget what it is to be a developer, and you're not a developer long enough to forget what it is to be a manager, and understanding those pressures. And as an industry, we could really do a much better job of making room for people who really are interested in straddling both of those worlds, and understanding both sides of it. So again, it's a little bit of a jump, but not too far from, I think, what we were talking about before.
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty spot on to the same idea. And I completely agree. I think in general, hierarchical, like very deeply hierarchical management structures tend to be bad on their own. So applying them at all to software is a bad idea. Makes you think of like the Peter Principle, which if you've ever heard of that. The Peter Principle is basically, to sum it up briefly, is the idea that everyone gets promoted to their highest level of incompetence, which is like you will continue to do good at jobs and get promoted until eventually you can't do your job, so you can't be promoted anymore. So you're bad at your job, and that's where you sit forever. And it's just kind of, it's like, it's one of those things where it's almost like a law, because it's like almost like a mathematical conclusion. If you build a structure this way, this is how things will go. People will push for promotions until they get a job they can't be good at, and people very rarely get demoted. You know what I mean? They just fire someone and then promote someone else to a job they can't do. And it's very interesting. And I like the parallel tracks idea. I like the idea of management shouldn't be viewed as better than development, you know, in some ways. I've worked at places where the person who was in charge on small teams was rotating. Like every new project, a new person got to be in charge of that, and everyone got a chance to do that. And that felt more natural than like being a manager and then not being a manager, because there's a weird power dynamic where my boss is no longer my boss. Like that can be tricky. When I worked for a code school for a while, I was one of those managers. I was in charge of a bunch of instructors, and I also taught. And it was very hard, like you said, to be teaching and then teaching instructors as their manager at the same time. So we were working out a system where you would teach for a certain amount of time, then you would manage for a certain amount of time, and you would go back and forth. You never forgot the lessons. We don't want people to be like, oh, well, when I used to teach in '85, it was like this, because things change too quickly to be able to be that distant from it for that long. Yeah, and I think flexibility in management is really important. I think you need to be able to be flexible as a manager, but also I think your structure as a company should be malleable enough to make changes. I think the biggest problem I see is a lot of companies solidify the way they're doing management and they never want to change it, despite it not working for a long time. But we can move on from there. Or else this podcast will become the Scrum and Management podcast, as we have brought up several times in the past. So with that, unless there's anything else that Amy or Ariel specifically wanted to bring up, I think we can kind of do our closing thoughts. Anything else? No? Okay. So then in that case, I kind of want to just do some thoughts, like kind of just wrapping up the whole book, general consensus about like, what do you think about, who would you recommend it to? Who would you not recommend it to? What would the caveats be if you were to give this to someone? Like, what would you say along with that? Amy, can you start us off?
Yeah, I think, I found this really fascinating as something to think about, having worked in a decent number of different structured companies that put out a bunch of different products. And I think it's really fascinating to think about where we were and how far we've come. But we did not cover this chapter because it's only in the anniversary edition. But there's a chapter called Propositions of the Mythical Man Month, True or False. And it basically pulls a bunch of statements from each of these chapters and puts them in axiom form. It's basically the book in bullet points. And reading this, I had a pretty strong reaction of like, wow, if you just pull this away from any of the context, like, I don't agree with most of these. And not in a, like that they're false, but just in like, it doesn't help me understand or control complexity in my own projects, and really move things forward. So I definitely think I would recommend this to someone who is looking for more context about where the profession was coming from, maybe that helps you think about where we're going to, and definitely about how we're dealing with many of the same things. Otherwise I might just recommend the Wikipedia article. Yeah, that's pretty much it for me.
So I'm going to quote a different chapter from the 20th anniversary edition. Just to make Justin feel extra bad. So at the beginning of chapter, what is it? Chapter 19, which is the 20-year reflection chapter. So he tells a little anecdote that he was waiting for a plane, and or sorry, he was on a plane, and he noticed the person next to him is reading the Mythical Man month. So okay, that's interesting. So he sort of like stays quiet the whole time, and finally, as they're getting towards the end, he says, "So how's that book? Do you recommend it?" And the person said, "Nothing in it I didn't know already." And he decided to not introduce himself out of concern for the other person's feelings. And there's a little bit of truth in that. That as you read this book, you sort of realize that, groundbreaking though it may have been in its time, there isn't a lot that has not either been completely rejected and lost in the sands of time, or conversely has become so much a part of the fabric of our industry that you don't need a book to tell it to you. So, which then, of course, brings the question of why are we still reading it? Why does it sell so many copies? And maybe it's just because, well, last year it sold this many copies, so this year it also sells a similar number of copies, and you could just kind of trace that back a whole bunch of years till it initially came out. Books that are popular tend to stay popular, far beyond sometimes what they should. But at the same time, you could also think about what are the core ideas here? What it's telling us, and are there things that we've missed? But I think even more than that, it's the only way to describe a line is to draw 2 points, and it's very, very easy to look at where we are today and just think that this is how it's always been, this is how it's going to be. But if you want to see where the industry is going, you have to look at where we came from. So I think I would actually recommend this to people who are really working on the cutting edge for 2 reasons. One is, again, if you want to know where the industry is going to go, you got to see not just where it is now, but where it's been in the past. And I'm realizing that this looks like I'm drawing in the wrong direction from the view opposite me. So I guess going this direction, which is my right to left. But the other piece of it is, I actually did my first machine learning or deep learning experiment last week, which was a whole lot of fun. And it was incredible how, we think of our machines as being so powerful, and then it takes, hours of, highly optimized calculations to give a mess solution to a relatively simple problem. And you sort of realize, wow, we have actually a long way to go in terms of what computers can do. And we're actually going to have to solve a lot of the same problems that we used to if we don't want all of our computers to burn up along the way, because wow, that computer gets hot from all from the intensity of the calculations that are being run, that are beyond its capabilities. And apparently Moore's law is over, so they're just not going to get any better. And that's actually kind of terrifying. So some of these issues are actually starting to reappear and come back, just in a totally different form. And it could be that looking back to how were these issues solved once upon a time could give us a sense of how to solve these issues moving forward. So those are kind of the 2 things that I'm thinking about. And the I guess the third thing that really pops in my head now is there were cases where the industry eventually did disagree with with the author, and sometimes there's a tendency to rediscover not just good ideas but bad ideas. And so if we don't look at the ideas of the past and understand the rationale behind them and why they were rejected, we have a strong possibility of reinventing, let's say, a JavaScript framework that does exactly whatever was once done. So those are the major points, the major takeaways for me.
Yeah, I like I like that consensus. I also liked Amy's as well. I feel like I'm a little bit in the middle between both of you, where I personally love history. I love context. When I was teaching, like the first day was like, let's talk about the beginning of computers, even though we're doing a web development class. Let's talk about like the 50s and the 60s, because I feel historical context gives us clarity for today. It answers all the whys that we don't know the answer to. You know, when I used to teach students, they'd be like, well, why is the command like this? I'm like, because some 22-year-old white dude in the 70s said so, because he was working all night. Like, I don't know, but that's probably the answer to every question when it comes to weird Unix stuff. And like, this book to me used to always be like the book you recommend to people. It was like one of the like top 5 books. Oh, you're gonna learn. You're a coder now. You're a developer. Look, read these books. And I don't feel like it's on that list for me anymore because of some of the things about like it being in the like culture now. It's in the water, so to speak. But kind of to what Ariel was saying, like, it's the kind of book I want to recommend to anyone one level beyond that. Like, if you are like serious about this career beyond just having a job, you're understanding how this industry has developed over time, then it's like, yeah, you should read it. Like, it's worth your time to devote to read this book to fully understand where we've come from. I think some of the industries that I'm kind of only loosely affiliated with, you know, like the gaming industry and some of the like cinema, those industries suffer the most when they lose touch with their own history. And I feel like tech is very prone to do that. Like, we do rediscover the same wheel over and over again. I still remember all of the ire on Twitter when Node first launched because NPM made the same problems like Bundler made like a decade prior. And it was like, no, we learned from this. Don't do it. And they did it anyways. Like, we do this all the time to ourselves. And there's a certain point where having a shared history that marches forward with us is something that'll help benefit the whole industry. You know, we are where we are as an industry because of abstractions that have built on top of old things, but we haven't done that with our like shared knowledge as much as we have with our code. So I think having that is useful. And one thing I've been trying to push myself to do is go back to our kind of goal as this book club, and how does this inform me being more empathetic, or how will this hopefully let someone else be more empathetic? And with this book, it's more of a stretch. Not that I think that is a detriment to it. It's still good. I'm glad we've read it. But like, I feel like some books more clearly define the empathy. You can start to see, okay, this helps me see the world a different way, to be more empathetic to my users or to my coworkers or something. I don't think I saw that as much in this book, but it's still good, I think, despite that. But I do want the 2017 abridged edition. The 50-year anniversary edition, please. It would be wonderful. Just bullet points on bullet points. I think it would be good. And unless anyone else has any more closing thoughts, I think we are good for this session. So to let everyone know, our next book that we'll be reading is Radical Candor by Kim Scott. So we'll be reading roughly the first half of that. And that'll be exciting. I'm really interested in diving into that book. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. You can stay updated about Dev Empathy events by following us on Twitter at Dev Empathy. And of course, you can join us on Slack using the link that's on our website, which is devempathybook.club. So we've been looking forward to interacting with you. We really want to grow the community. We really want more people in Slack talking, chatting together, so we can grow this community, become better developers and better people at the same time. Thanks for coming out. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.